radio, news and views beyond the mainstream media.
Imagine a world with natural clouds, clean air, clean water, and natural food. Why in the world are they spraying? If you love your family, if you love your children, if you love our planet, it's time to get involved. In 2010, millions of people were awakened to the question of what? Now the next question that remains to be answered is, why in the world are they spraying? An investigative look into one of the many agendas associated with chemtrail geoengineering programs, weather control. Why has our weather been changing? Are the long white lines in the sky changing our weather? Could there be a monetary and political agenda behind these damaging programs? Why in the world are they spraying? Order your copy today at www.whyintheworldaretheyspraying.com. Why in the world are they spraying?
And if you control the weather, you're going to control the planet. It's that simple.
You're listening to the Earth Needs Rebel Show, live from Dublin, Ireland, with your host, Kevin Bull. Join the rebels at freethinkingvoice.org. Apply to take the Rebel platform by emailing the rebels at the Earth Needs Rebel Show at freethinkingvoice.tv.
The higher you build your barriers, the taller I become. The farther you take my rights away, the faster I will run. You can deny me, you can decide to turn your face away. No matter, 'cause there's something inside so strong. I know that I can make it, though you're doing me wrong, so wrong. You thought that my pride was gone. Oh no, something inside so strong. Oh, something inside so strong.
Hello listeners, welcome to Three Thinking Voice, the Earth Needs Rebel Show, broadcast on Orion Talk Radio from Tonawanda, New York, 1650 on the AM, global on the internet, and don't forget your TuneIn radio and now your iTunes feed. If you want to know how to connect to iTunes, just go to oriontalkradio.com to the front page and you'll find an article on the front page guiding you how to connect your iTunes compatible devices to Orion Talk Radio. Hope you enjoy the new feed, folks, as we're growing all the time. Right, some information for the show. This is the first hour of the show, and this will help you if you're listening on archive or the Earth Needs Rebels breakfast shows, which are broadcast at various times of the day in 1 hour teasers. I'm Kevin Bull. I'm based in Dublin in Ireland. The show is, of course, Three Thinking Voice, the Earth Needs Rebel Show, broadcast from Orion Talk Radio, a great station speaking out. And today's live show date is Tuesday, the 12th of November, 2013. That's Tuesday, the 12th of November, 2013. Now, today's an important show, really, because this is actually episode 5, and I'm going to bring Dr. David M. Allen, MD, Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry from the University of Tennessee Health Science Center, who is the author of the book, How Dysfunctional Families Spur Mental Disorders. And I can tell you that Dr. Allen has been fascinating through this 5-episode series. He's gone really in depth with us and given a lot of time to explain about borderline personality disorder in his view and his approach to it, which is a combination of psychiatry and psychology. It's a lovely view to work with people with borderline personality disorder and families as well. We covered in the last episode working with families, and if you want to pick up on this, just go to our base site and go to threethinkingvoice.org, and through there you'll be able to access archives by searching for Dr. David Allen, and you'll be able to pick up the previous 4 episodes. Now tonight, or if you're in if you're in the UK or you're in Europe, it's tonight, but if you're in the US or Canada, it's this afternoon. This is going to be an episode about the cross-generational factors of borderline personality disorder, where it can result in harm in future generations. And this is so important because if we can understand some of this, we can put some prevention in there and try and stop this going cross-generational. But we can't do that without the top experts like a professor of psychiatry like Dr. David M. Allen giving us the information we need to do that. And that's what today's show is going to be about. I'm going to bring Dr. David Allen on now, so we'll be making the communications through the telephone system with the US in order to do that. And he's not going to realise he's coming onto the live show, so you'll have to excuse me doing this. But this is how we're going to do it. And I'll introduce David. Dr. David Allen as soon as we can get him on, and we'll take it away and we'll explore all avenues and see what we can find about borderline personality disorder as a cross-generational factor. Now, Dr. David Allen, I'm bringing you onto the live show, my friend, and the listeners are with us, and I've given an introduction as to what this particular show's about as episode 5 of a most interesting series on borderline personality disorder. And we're going to be looking in a big part of today's show, I've explained to listeners, in the cross-generational factors and see what we can do and try and stop this if we can, because it's an awful problem that crosses the generations and has been around for a very long time. So before I say any more, Dr. David Allen, welcome once again, my friend, to Three Thinking Voice, the Earth Needs Rebel show, broadcast on Orion Talk Radio.
Well, good day to everybody.
Well, we're certainly glad to have you on board, Dr. Allen, because we need to look at this. I mean, we've got a tremendous amount of information in the first 4 episodes of this to understand the disorder, a very complex disorder, borderline personality disorder. And in fact, I was only talking earlier on in the last week to a professor of psychology about ADHD, and we crossed on to this area as well in the complexity. It is a very complex disorder indeed. But I think you've opened the mind to a lot of listeners to understand this. It's a tremendous chance to do this. But I'm really interested in the cross-generational factors and anything else you want to add on to the end of the 4-part series we've got so far, so we don't miss anything out. So listeners have got the lot. And I know you're being followed very well by the number of comments I'm getting through Facebook after the shows, my friend.
Okay, so I guess the cross-generational thing is a part of a bigger problem. I mean, there are actually studies that show that dysfunctional family patterns are passed on from one generation to the next. And again, in our world of everything has a biological cause or caused by a drug or something like that, people don't want to look at family dynamics and this sort of thing. So this literature gets passed on. And the people that do the other kind of literature don't read social psychology or attachment literature or all these other literatures. There was a quote I read about, one way to avoid the tyranny of any particular field or literature is to read other literatures. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of that going on. So the Murray Bowen, who's sort of the family systems therapist that kind of inspired a lot of what I do in therapy, thought that it took at least 3 generations, in fact, to create the self-destructive behavior and interpersonal problems that we see in highly dysfunctional families. And one of the things we do in therapy is try to trace the development over several generations, and sometimes it goes back even further than 3 generations. And we lose the scent because there's nobody alive that can tell us exactly what happened. But usually we can come up with a pretty good theory about why certain things came to pass and how personalities of different propensities and genetic backgrounds interact with their culture and historical forces and events that happen to them in peculiar to create their own behavior, which then affects their relationship with their children. And the attachment literature clearly shows that the best predictor of how you're going to relate to your own children is how your parents related to you and how well you were attached with them. And of course, there's exceptions to that, but that's a huge factor and probably bigger than any other single factor, either biological, psychological, or sociological.
It's the factors in this, if you look at it from a general public point of view, of listener point of view, people are aware of borderline personality disorder, but they don't really understand until they've got a great chance with what you've given us in the first 4 episodes sort of thing. And it has really stirred things up, I can assure you, on both areas of this. I've had some controversial Facebook communications.
Yeah, unfortunately it's becoming more common too, and it's showing up in movies a lot more, and not always well shown, but
I think I know more females than males tend to have this disorder, and for a lot of the males, I've had communications where they've wrote to me and they thanked you for what you've contributed because it's given them understanding, which they haven't really had before. And for a lot of the ladies, they've been explaining to me their situation, and I've had quite in-depth exchanges on Facebook as well on this. And really, they've been quite amazingly patient on it, even though they might have controversial views themselves from it within this, because projection is a very big part of this anyway. And talking about it leads to projection anyway, doesn't it, Dr. Allen?
Well, there's so many facets. I was just commenting on a comment to my blog that I didn't put in the proper disclaimer when I listed a post. I said, but the only trouble is I'd have to, the whole post would be disclaimers, because there's so many permutations and combinations and exceptions and other considerations that to make generalities is always going to cause a great deal of grief. So sometimes I can address them in my answers to some of the comments I get on my blogs, but it's real easy to offend one party or the other. And dealing with the parents of patients with borderline personality disorder, even as when they come to me, which is not that common, for therapy themselves, I have to tread much more lightly in a lot of ways than I would if I were treating the adult person with the disorder and helping them to deal with their parents, because guilt is a huge factor in the families that create borderline personality disorder. So it's very easy to sound like I'm blaming the parents for their own problems when they too are often victimized in their own families growing up in one way or another. So it's a very touchy subject. So I try to put in as many disclaimers as I can, but I probably won't get to all of them.
It's very easy, isn't it, when people are carrying guilt, but they know part of that is rational from their previous generation, to get into a situation in counselling and talking where it's so easy to trigger them into that they then go into defensive projection. It gets into a bit of a pickle, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, there are 2 parent support groups in the United States for the parents of patients with the disorder. And of course, they want to focus more on the biological stuff. And even when they talk about Marsha Linehan's stuff, they focus on her half of the theory that say they have a biogenetic propensity to it and leave out the invalidating environment part. But those people have a very biased view, because the parents that were actually physically and sexually abusive, or severely so, are not going to join a parent support group. So there was even an article in the Journal of Personality Disorders which I reviewed, and I didn't recommend publication because they didn't acknowledge that the sample of parents they were dealing with was a completely biased sample, and I was ignored. They went ahead and published it without even putting in the disclaimer that people who go to the websites of these parent support groups and interact with them are probably not going to be the more severely abusive contingent. And one of the leaders of one of the groups even admitted to me in private that she knows I'm pretty much correct, because she had been physically abused. But that isn't necessarily, how they're going to play it, because they're going to scare people away. You do have a contingent of parents that are sort of at the over-involvement pole of the dichotomy I discussed last time between oscillating between extremes of over and under involvement. So the over-involved ones that aren't abusive, who kind of end up squashing their kids' individuality and their ability to grow up, and don't realize that their parenting skills are creating the very monsters that they're then complaining about. They're the ones that are more likely to join these parent support groups. But you can't just start by telling them, it's all your fault, or, they're just going to get defensive and angry and run away. And blame's got nothing to do with it anyways. We're here to figure out what the patterns are, how they were created, and how we can stop them, not affixing moral, turpitude or blame. If I were a judge and parents abused their children, the parents go to jail. I had no problem with that at all. But I'm not a judge, I'm a therapist, so I have to develop empathy for even the most abusive of parents to figure out, what made them do that. And that's not the same, as I said, I think before, as sympathy. It's not saying, well, it's okay that you were abusive, because it definitely wasn't okay. And to say it was okay would be lying and would not be empathic, because they'd know it. And people aren't as stupid as they pretend to be a lot of the time.
Well, exactly, if we look forward in the current generation, if someone's experienced an upbringing in this environment and they're aware, possibly, that they're even diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, a lot of the time they're quite empathetic. It varies all the time, and during that time they would want to try and do the best in many ways, but the empathy varies. There's all kinds of things vary during the adult period because of the acting out and the different fluctuations in the person's mood and feelings. It is quite a challenge, isn't it, Dr. Allen?
Well, and then it's because everybody's really adept at pushing each other's buttons. It's hard to talk about anything without doing that, because these patterns develop. Old habits aren't that easy to break. That's what amazes me, that some therapists think that this could be treated in short-term therapy when we can't even get people to stick to a weight loss program, let alone change their entire way of relating to their parents and their siblings and their spouses. Like, that's going to change in a short period of time. It just doesn't. It's too habitual, it's too ingrained, and it's too automatic. Half the battle is getting everybody to slow down and think about what they're doing and saying. And since I use role-playing a lot in therapy, I start out by having the patient play their parents so I can see what they're up against. And when I first started doing that, it was like, oh, my God, no wonder you act that way. Would they really act that way? And sometimes they wouldn't, but a lot of times they would. And I've seen it, now that I've seen the parents a lot of times. But then we have to switch roles, and I have to play the parent. So one of the ways I do that, and I'm from Hollywood originally, so I know a little bit about method acting, is I have to figure out what's going to get the parent to be angry and defensive and then go into denial mode. What mistakes is the patient going to make in the way they approach the parent that's going to set that off? And then when they do it, I give them worst-case scenarios consistent with what the parents have done in the past in order to prepare them for the worst case. Luckily, most of the time, they don't get the worst case, but occasionally they do. So I'm sort of preparing them, A, to have a success experience with their initial forays into this, and B, to know what to do if it starts to go terribly wrong. And they have specific instructions on what to do when things start to go wrong and what signals to look at in themselves that tell them they need to back off right away. And I always tell them they can always say, look, I don't want to fight. Let me think about this, and I'll get back to you, to the parents. They have to say the latter part, or else the parent kind of wins, if you could call losing winning, in that the parent knows how to get them to shut up. So if they don't say, I'm going to come back about this, I'm not going to let you off the hook, that kind of makes the process that much harder. But if they feel like themselves getting angry or feeling really hurt and not knowing how to respond, they're coached to say, I don't want to fight. Let me think about this some more and get back. And sometimes it's hard to do that because the parent will keep calling back 20 times or follow them into the next room. So we have to, if they're likely to do that, and patients are pretty good at predicting what their parents are going to do because they've lived with them for so long, then we have to prepare them for that possibility and how to handle that. So it's a complicated process, and it takes some practice. Some people are just naturally good at it, and I don't have to practice with them much. They just take the cue and they go with it. But occasionally people will they'll be so angry that they decide to do it the nasty way anyways, despite my warnings about it. And, of course, it usually goes as badly as I would have predicted. But at that point, they can't blame me. Because it used to be they'd come back, and if it went wrong, they'd blame you because you gave them bad advice. And sometimes we don't guess correctly, but we do have these sort of escape valves that they can get out of it. And if they don't kind of do what we talked about, then we talk about, well, why didn't you, and what happened, and what made you decide not to, or why did you react negatively and not pull out of the conversation. So this is, and then to get them to actually go and confront the parents, that's the hardest part. That takes the longest.
It must be. It must be.
Like I have one lady now, it's been like 6 months we figured out what the right strategy, and she just did half of it the other day. She left out the other half. what they're supposed to kind of do when they get down to the nub of the issue is to confront the parent with the double messages that they're getting. You say you want this, but then you do that. Well, I coached this lady to sort of blame herself first in a way to soften up the parent by saying, I guess I make you feel really helpless. I'm sorry to do that. But then when you respond the way you do it, I respond badly. And she left that part out. She left the latter part out. But I still had to say, great, you did the first half, fantastic. Now let's work on putting both parts together, because it went fairly well. In that the patient's mother didn't know how to respond, basically, and kind of changed the subject, but they weren't fighting as much after that for a short time. So that was encouraging.
One of the other areas which is interesting, obviously we've got a spectrum of functioning, and we can all be harmed, but we can all have different functioning. And there's a spectrum between very emotional functioning, where we're really in there with the feelings and we find it very difficult to step back and overview ourselves, to the intellectual end of the spectrum where we can stand back more easily and view ourselves. And that brings about different integration for someone in counselling as to how much you can discuss what's going off, how you would discuss it, working ways forward. That must bring an interesting area to you as to approach this in different ways with different people in the spectrum.
Well, the trick is we were dealing with, this is oversimplified, but the primitive part of the brain called the limbic system, there's a part called the amygdala, which I mentioned before, and it goes off before the thinking parts of the brain do, and people react to things that have been ingrained in them since they were small children, and the parents are by far the most potent reinforcers for this sort of behavior, if you want to look at it from an environmental behaviorist standpoint. It's not food pellets and electric shocks that motivate people. It's their relationships. And parents are very influential whether they like it or not. And when the children seem to be oppositional to the parent, that's because the adult child thinks that that's what their role is, that the parent really wants them to be oppositional. So in a sense, it's a paradox because they're not being oppositional at all. They're cooperating by being oppositional, if that makes sense. And if they've been traumatized, then as you yourself have brought up several times, that can lead to some long-lasting, if not permanent, effects on the stress response reaction and the pituitary hypothalamic tract in the brain, and that's very hard to control. But it can be controlled, but it does take a lot of practice.
What I wonder is, because we've got such a spread in society, I can obviously get this totally on an effective way. If we're looking at an effective display where we're talking about mainly feelings between the parties and we can see it, we can overview it intellectually and look at that and make an evaluation. But this must get incredibly complex if you've got a very bright family where that's turned into cognitive role play between the parties. I'm presuming this can happen as well.
Oh, yeah, certainly it can. There's all kinds of complicating factors. And interestingly, the more people that are involved, the harder it is to deal with. Because then you've got to, in dealing with the primary attachment figure, other relatives often come, as I always joke, come out of the woodwork and say, how did you talk to your mother that way? And this sort of thing. And we have to, what's called de-triangulate all these other relatives. So they can talk to their parents without interference from all these other relatives that are all have a stake in the homeostasis, and they're all worried about the mental stability of the parents. So the bigger the family is, the more complicated it is. And often the smarter the family, the more complicated it is. Because they...
Just going into the break, Dr. Allen now. We'll be back out of the break at about 35:10. 35:10, my friend, to continue with the interview, if that's okay with you.
Sounds good.
Free speech guaranteed. You're listening to the Orion Talk Radio Network.
Since 9/11, the people of the United States have sadly witnessed the largest transformation in our nation's history. And since then, we've collectively been terrorized over and over again by flag-waving politicians and the corporate news media. We've been sold a nebulous, never-ending war on terror. We've been psychologically conditioned with fear through repeated, endless warnings. A Patriot Act that threatens our democracy. A Military Commissions Act that disregards our Bill of Rights. a homegrown terrorism act that makes us all a threat, and an oppressive fascist state before you know it. Have you ever asked yourself, of all the government failures on 9/11, how is it that our politicians made us pay the price? Don't buy the lie. We're Americans, and we don't give up our Constitution to anyone, terrorists or politicians. We fought wars just to have these rights, and at Orion Talk Radio, we're damn well going to fight to keep them.
IRN USA Radio News, I'm Hope Duggar. The Justice Department filed court papers today summarizing a settlement in its lawsuit against the merger of American Airlines and U.S. Airways. The settlement ends a lawsuit that sought to derail the merger and allows for American and U.S. Airways to become the world's largest airline. The Association of Flight Attendants, CWA, representing U.S. Airways flight attendants, said it was reviewing the proposed settlement. President Obama is nominating a top Treasury Department official to run the independent agency that regulates the futures and options markets. The White House says Obama will announce the nomination of Timothy Massad to head the Commodity Futures Trading Commission Tuesday. For the past 3 years, Massad has overseen the Troubled Asset Relief Program, the bank rescue plan known as TARP. If confirmed by the Senate, Massad would succeed Gary Gensler, who plans to step down when his term ends in January. Obama is expected to use Massad's nominating ceremony to call on Congress to fully fund the CFTC, one of the smallest and most thinly funded U.S. agencies. This is IRN USA Radio News.
Policies issued by American General Life Insurance Company, Houston, Texas. Not available in all states. For details, visit AIGdirect.com.
So I knew it was important to have life insurance to protect our family, but I was putting it off. But then yesterday, a girlfriend of mine asked me, point blank, what would happen if you lost your husband? How would you pay the bills, the mortgage, the car payments, food? And that's when it really hit me, and I realized I needed to get us life insurance right now. So I called AIG Direct, and in less than 5 minutes, I had a quote. I was shocked at how affordable it is. Just $18 a month for $250,000 of term life coverage. I feel so much better knowing the kids and I are protected. And my husband was so happy I got the quote.
Save up to 70% when you get term life insurance through AIG Direct. Call now for a free, no-obligation quote. It only takes 5 minutes, and you could save up to 70%. 1-800-322-1427. That's 1-800-322-1427. Call now. 1-800-322-1427.
Extend your life with Extendovite.
My name is Don Wiskin. I had a massive heart attack at 42. The doctors could do nothing but send me home with disability as my future. I reversed the damage done to my heart with a natural remedy. I am now 58 and contribute my good health today to Extendovite. You have heard my messages for many years. A lot of people have taken Extendovite and improved their health issues. We are surrounded by fast food, toxic air, and chemicals that our body cannot eliminate. As we age, they can age us faster. Clean yourself out with Extendovite, available in capsule or liquid form. Get a 2-month supply for only $69.95 plus shipping and handling. You can live a longer, healthier life just by calling 1-877-928-8822 or visit heartdrop.com.
Extend your life with Extendovite. Extend your life with Extendovite.
Everyone around me seems to get sick but me. My brother got the flu twice, my mother was down with some sort of fever, people at work were taking sick days off, and others were just plain tired and run down. And me? Well, I just keep feeling great all the time with Extendovite. My grandfather used to talk about the power of garlic and other herbs he took that kept him healthy. I'm lucky. Extendovite was just what I needed to keep me healthy, and Extendovite is all natural. Extendovite was designed for the heart but does so much more by keeping me healthy all the time. I'll take Extendovite forever. Get your 2-month supply for only $69.95 plus shipping and handling. My name is Rick, and you can be like me just by calling 1-877-928-8822 or visit heartdrop.com.
Extend your life with Extendovite.
Hi, this is Kevin Ball. Be a rebel. Join me on the Earth Needs Rebel Show. Weekdays 1 p.m. Eastern, Saturdays 9 a.m., Sundays 8 a.m. to 12 on Orion Talk Radio.
All that
Hello, listeners. Welcome back to Three Thinking Voice, the Earth Rebel Show, broadcast on Orion Talk Radio from Tonawanda, New York, 1650 on the AM, global on the internet, and don't forget your TuneIn Radio and your iTunes feeds. Orion Talk Radio welcomes back Johnny English and Broken Man Radio. Tune in for one of the fastest hours in Truth Radio, weeknights with Johnny English, Monday to Friday from 9 to 10 p.m. ET, right here on Orion Talk Radio, news and views beyond the mainstream media. Now, today, listeners, if you're following us, you'll know, but let me just remind you, if you just joined us, we have Dr. David M. Allen, MD, Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry from the University of Tennessee Health Science Center, and he's discussing his book, How Dysfunctional Families Spur Mental Disorders, and the speciality area of this, and I have to say Dr. Allen is really giving us this from psychiatry and psychology, is borderline personality disorder, a very complex disorder is indeed, and we're moving into an area of, this is episode 5, folks. You can pick up the first 4 episodes by going to threethinkingvoice.org, our base site, and searching the archives for Dr. David Allen. I'm sure you're going to enjoy them. He's also a very charismatic character in interview as well, in the way he puts this across. And we're looking at the cross-generational factors here. This is the helpful bit, I think, in episode 5. This is the last episode on the subject of where we're going to look at what protections we can put in. What can we do if we have experienced this kind of upbringing and we have borderline personality disorders, where we're trying to look at it from. So that's where we're going from the other side of the break. And if I can put to you, Dr. Allen, I was discussing in the break a little bit with you, to reiterate, we've got a wide range of functioning in society. Some people can be very, very emotional, and there isn't much scope for cognitive intellectualization over the top. And the other end of the spectrum, and all points in between, of course, we can be very intellectual, think through things, and then cognitively we can display in a very different way. But of course, when we go to the next generation, and we're going to bring up our own children, then that must present differently depending on how emotional or how cognitively we are in functioning to our children in the next generation. I don't know whether that's a good way to open this.
Well, I mean, it's always a mix of both cognitive and emotion. I mean, there's patterns that have, like I said, have been passed down from one generation to another, and they're automatic because they've been conditioned, and they seem to work. Plus, we have this tendency to want to sacrifice ourselves for the good of our group that's sort of ingrained in us. And how much one is allowed to think about what's doing is one of the things that there are family rules about. A lot of the times it's you can think about this, but don't you dare think about that. I mean, I hate to pick on religion, but that. Yeah, I've talked to a lot of people when they're sitting in church wondering about how something made sense, and when they ask about it, they're basically told to shut the hell up, and how dare they question it. And family myths or family collectively held beliefs are often held unquestionably, and they're a badge of group membership, and they're just not to be challenged. So that's one of the rules that somebody's going to be dealing with. Being in the middle of an emotional roller coaster, I mean, it does make a difference how you understand what you're dealing with, though, because if you don't understand it, it makes it a lot more difficult to figure out how to respond than if you do understand something. And as I think I've mentioned at last count, there were over 400 different schools of thought in psychology, which goes to show we haven't all figured it out ourselves, and yet we expect our patients to have figured it out when they were small children. And that's just not a reasonable expectation. So if your parents are saying one thing and doing another, or saying two contradictory things at different times, or saying they believe something but acting like they believe something else, or they're talking to the other adults about the matter in one way and to you a completely different way, and it's totally contradictory, it's very confusing. And it's hard not to get emotional when you're being confused. And when you try to bring it up, the family reacts in a very negative way. And that negative way can either be something very similar or very mild seeming, like shifting in their chairs and acting uncomfortable. It could be denial, saying, you know what you're talking about, that there's no such contradiction, all the way to they could be, thrown across the room and beaten severely or even raped. Again, I can't predict necessarily which of those is going to happen in a given family until I get to know them, but I can guarantee they're not going to answer the question about, well, you said this, but then you just contradicted yourself. And people, until they reach about the age of 12, if we study cognitive development, think there's one right answer. They don't really consider ambivalence or I'm confused about this or I'm not sure what I want myself as possibilities. They can sort of vaguely know that intellectually, but it doesn't seem to matter. They have to figure out the one right answer. And often they will come up with if they're getting contradictory signals, again, stop me if I brought this up in one of the prior shows, they'll come up with two conclusions. That that their parents want them to behave a certain way, for instance, but they also like to complain about it and blame you. So then they'll have to come up with ways to meet both of those demands simultaneously. And when they finally hit on it, and it works, then it gets reinforced constantly. It works. It solves the problem temporarily. In the long run, it makes it worse, actually. But in the short term, it solves the problem, so you don't necessarily think about it anymore. You just react. But that doesn't mean you can't. You can't think about it. And one of the reasons we do the genogram, or looking at the development of the parents, is to try and figure out why the parents are so confused themselves and why they're giving off these mixed messages, I hate you, I need you. In order so that the person can understand it better and then react more intellectually and less emotionally. As I was saying with you at the break, I validate the emotions as being very reasonable. If somebody's kicking you in the knee constantly, it's eminently reasonable to get angry. In fact, I'd say there was something terribly wrong with you if you didn't get angry. Yet we're constantly accusing patients with the disorder of having anger control problems or trust issues. Well, if you've been stabbed in the back by everybody that you know and care about, if you blindly trusted people, you'd be an idiot. And these people aren't idiots. They're very smart. Yet we're the first to say that, or they're overreacting. That's another one that they get saddled with. Well, you don't know what they're reacting to. You may think you do, but you don't, because you don't know their history. And you don't know all the intricate details of why saying certain things pushes their buttons. To you, it seems like an overreaction, but it's not. When you finally get to know them, you realize that it's a very sensible reaction. If emotions can be sensible, emotions aren't supposed to be inherently rational or irrational, but they're certainly more understandable if they're the same emotions that most of us would feel in the same situation. And if we knew what the borderline so the patient with borderline personality was going through, we'd understand them better. But we don't, so we make these incredibly invalidating statements about them without really understanding what's making them tick. In a way, we're recreating the family dynamics when we do that, because they're trying to figure out what's making their parents tick, and they can't figure that out either. And when they do it, they get accused of things. So that's the invalidation again.
I think what you're saying is very valid, incredibly valid, really, in what I've seen through counselling and in life experience. I'm 59 now, so I've been around a very long time. And when we look at the relationships that are from the background that creates borderline personality disorder, such as a diagnostic condition, we do see these behaviours played out quite strongly. But initially, what we tend to see is when it's an acquaintance or someone fairly distant, it's fairly calm. And the closer the relationship, the more complex this tends to become. Even before you get round to having children or anything of this nature, you've got to manage a relationship. And relationships from someone that's been brought up in a background that results in borderline personality disorder can be very challenging indeed initially, I understand.
Well, yeah, well, again, it's very complicated because you're trained to react in a certain way, and you enlist other people, lovers and friends, to help you stay in this character that helps stabilize your family. So your whole life basically is wrapped around you playing this role that you're playing in your family. And the reason you don't want to give it up is because there are horrible negative consequences if you do. First of all, the parents get destabilized, and that makes us more unstable because of the skin selection thing that we're all saddled with. Plus, you don't know who you are anymore because you've been playing the role so long that the role seems like the real you, and the real you, which is sort of underneath it all, you don't know who that is. So it's very disconcerting. That's called groundlessness. It's the feeling that you get when all the rules are taken away and you don't know who you're supposed to be anymore, and the real you seems foreign. And that actually, a lot of times, patients will get more depressed or more anxious, and therapists will think they're getting worse when in fact they're getting better, but they're going through this groundlessness period, and that's a very dangerous time for suicides and stuff like that because people think you're getting worse, and they think they're getting worse, and they don't understand it, and they're so in that horrible feeling that we do anything to avoid. That's why people don't talk about this feeling, except for some weird existentialist intellectuals with people that seem to talk about this sort of thing. We don't know what it is, and it's very disconcerting, and it's very frightening. And so that's the only selfish reason people are self-destructive, if I can be, because otherwise it's a contradiction in terms. Being self-destructive can't really be selfish in the traditional sense of selfishness, because it's like 1984. It's like saying war is peace. It doesn't make any sense. So if you view it as being self-destructive as you're being self-destructive because you're sacrificing yourself for the benefit of the sort of greater good of the family or the culture, that puts a whole different spin on it.
So if we're looking at the stage prior to engaging in relationships, and you've got a person that's come from a background that's creating a lot of the profile of borderline personality disorder, I'm taking it there's a need to address this separately from relationships first, in counselling, working with someone as a therapist to get an understanding before you engage in relationships. Otherwise, does it get more complicated when you're trying to manage a relationship at the same time?
Well, yeah, I do things in a stepwise fashion. The first thing I have to do is get the patient's cooperation to get them to quit trying to enlist me as a helper or an enabler. And people never believe me when I say this, but I can train residents to do it. It's really not that hard to do that part. Again, a patient has to be somewhat motivated, and the family has to have some inkling that they'd like things to be different, because if that doesn't exist, then the patient will run for the hills the second you try to do anything like this. But getting them to stop and think about what they're doing and cooperate with you and start telling you the truth about what's really going on, because it's don't ask, don't tell. If you don't know the right questions to ask, they ain't going to tell you. And a lot of psychiatrists and therapists don't know the right questions to answer, so they're not hearing half the story, and they think they're getting the whole story, and they're kidding themselves. They don't know what's going on. People don't share their deepest, darkest secrets and shames with complete strangers, especially when people they're supposed to have trusted stab them in their back. Why would they trust a therapist with that sort of thing? They have to realize, A, you can be empathic and you're not going to act like their parents, and B, you kind of know what you're doing before they'll even tell you what's going on in any detail. Plus, you have to sort of know what questions to ask and how to ask them. If you're too confrontational, they'll get defensive, obviously. If you're not confrontational enough, they'll continue to snow you. So you have to strike the right balance. And unfortunately, finding therapists who are familiar with family dynamics and look at personality disorders from the interpersonal perspective rather than just viewing it as some kind of defect in the person or some kind of a biological abnormality, those kinds of therapists are not easy to find. You really have to ask around, because even the predominant therapy paradigm, cognitive behavioral therapy, uses something called dialectical behavior therapy, Marshall Linehan's model, and they spend the first year focusing on your self-destructive behavior in isolation, so you can sort of cope with your stress a little bit better, rather than changing the environment which is causing the stress in the first place. To me, that's way more important than just having you calm down or suffer more gracefully, as I put it. So the first step is to get them to trust you a little bit. As far as the self-injuring and stuff like that, most of the time certain medications, if you know what you're doing, can help that. They may not stop it altogether, but they can cut it down quite a bit without snowing the patient. because that's what another thing a lot of psychiatrists do, is they'll just give them a lot of sedating drugs. And I've seen patients on the most unbelievable cocktail of medications. And the doctors don't even ask them what's going on at home and why they're reacting the way that they're reacting. They're just trying to get them to stop reacting by drugging them. And that's not useful. But certain medications can raise the bar so that it takes more to get the person into a dysregulated state where they start cutting themselves. Because that's the common denomination of self-injuring, is that it releases endorphins or the morphine-like substances in your brain and you calm down. Now, we may wonder why that would have developed from an evolutionary standpoint, but it's been shown over and over again. And I think one of the things that sets up is when they feel incredibly helpless, when they have to solve some kind of a family problem and they don't know what to do. And they're paralyzed. And then, but being paralyzed is not an option. Although a lot of times I tell them, well, you don't have to do anything. You think you have to do something, but this is going to pass and be replaced by another crisis, probably in the next hour or two. So really, you don't have to do anything. So the best thing is to do nothing, in fact. And patients find that very comforting, because they think they got to solve this problem. It's like it's life or death. And it can be life or death, but it usually isn't at that particular moment.
One of the other is, I don't want to stereotype this too much, because males are affected as well, but far more females seem to be affected with borderline personality disorder. So my experience of it is that way round. And with ladies, relationships, their first relationships can be very challenging, because they've come from this environment and they're trying to engage in a one-to-one relationship and manage that. And often that can become abusive because of the complications around it. It can trigger violence in the partner and all kinds of things like this. And after a period of time, often ladies, well, not often, but some ladies break away from relationships, finding them not working well, isolate themselves to try and take stock of things, or they perceive that the problem is men.
Yeah.
You know where I'm going here, because they can't get that, and it's really sad, really, because they're obviously trying the best to try and engage in a relationship, and it's so difficult, isn't it?
Well, it is. First of all, I want to address the discrepancy in gender. We really don't know. The ones that come to treatment are majority women, but I'm sure there's a lot of people with borderline personality disorder that are males that they don't come to treatment, because they also tend to be more sociopathic when they're males, although the females can be very sociopathic as well. So they may just not be coming in for treatment. But there's a huge gender issue. As I said in one of the previous episodes, the main conflict in borderline family is having children. And that affects mothers more than fathers, because mothers traditionally have been more involved with raising children than dad does. And we can call that sexist if you want. And we may want to change that dynamic. But in the world as it existed not too long ago, almost all of the child rearing fell on mom, and dad was only peripherally he'd come home and take the kids out and have fun, and mom would be the one stuck home doing all the dirty work and taking care of the discipline. So they're more likely to have conflicts over having children than men are, because that was their role. That was their whole purpose in being at one point. But now we have technology, and we have two-career families, and we have daycare centers, and we have a lot of other modern conveniences, and women are no longer interested in just being, housewives and mothers anymore. So daughters often get it more than sons, but sons can get it too. And, there's the borderline is almost a parody of an extreme female. In fact, there was histrionic or hysterical personality disorder, as it used to be called, was sort of the quintessential woman in Freud time who would constantly act like being seductive and then get angry if the male would respond. And histrionic personality sort of morphed into borderline personality disorder. So we don't really see much histrionic personality disorder anymore, but some of the issues are still around. And with men, the parody of the masculine is the narcissistic male. And so now we're seeing a lot more narcissistic females and a lot more females with borderline with males with borderline tendencies than we used to. So there's been a change, over several decades, which again shows that it's a cultural issue and not just a biological one, as some people would have us believe. But yeah, they're the ones that often get the gender conflicts, which then are passed down from one generation to another. So there may be first-generation borderline patients and second-generation borderline patients. And I'm using borderline as an adjective here, not as a noun. So readers, calm down. I'm not trying to stereotype. Just trying to save some words. And it gets worse in some ways, but it can get worse with one daughter, and the sister kind of escapes relatively unscathed because most of the focus is on one or the other of the two sisters. Or the brothers can get involved, or they might not be involved. Again, the number of different varieties of this is staggering, but there are a lot of common themes which make it a little bit more simple. But again, the details matter because when you're planning strategies to counter the automatic reactions within the family, you have to tailor them to all of the individuals involved. So you can't just use generic skills like assertiveness training to talk about how you're going to be assertive with your parents. They don't work.
No. This is the issue around this as well. Because we very much work with role models, don't we? We do function automatically. We don't realise how much, do we, Dr. Allen?
Well, no. There's modelling and everything. Now, you can take that idea a little bit too far too, and say that that the rest of the world doesn't matter. But that would only be true as if one comedian says, if you live in a cave and don't get cable. I mean, you sort of intellectually can see that other people don't live the way that you do. And you see it on TV, so it's not like you don't know.
No, we're just going into the news break now, Dr. Allen, and we'll pick this up at 7 minutes past the hour, or just afterwards, the other side of the news.
Okay.
DependableVoice.com, the total solution, one-stop shop for your business telecommunications needs. Nationwide business class telecommunications services, providing voice and data, voice over internet, and hosted PBX. Dependable Voice is now offering the first month free for any voice over internet and hosted PBX services. Save up to 50% on your current phone bill and save thousands of dollars with no need to purchase PBX hardware. Hosted PBX and voice over internet services include free local and long-distance calling to the U.S., Canada, and Caribbean. Email to voicemail, follow me services, multiple visual call reports, dynamic auto attendant, advanced ACD and call queue, unified voice and fax messaging, and much, much more. Plus, get your first month free with a minimum 3-phone system. Call Dependable Voice today at 1-888-346-1085 or visit them online at dependablevoice.com. That's dependablevoice.com. Dependable Voice, the total solution for business telecommunications.
Orion News Talk exists because the corporate news media has failed us miserably.
Our media has been controlled for decades.
In 1917, J.P. Morgan bought up or infiltrated the top 25